Hi, it's me again, Trishulliano, and welcome back to my channel. So we are now in the lesson 6 in our complete AutoCAD training course for 2D and 3D. And for now, we are still in the data entry methods, but this time we are going to use the relative coordinates. So what is this relative coordinates all about? Okay, so we are using this formula or this format at change in x, comma, change in y. So the reference point is the last point entered. So unlike in our absolute coordinate, so our reference point is always the origin. But using the relative coordinates, the last point entered will be our reference point. So we have an example here. So from point 1 to point 2, we have a difference of 5. So this is 5. Medyo malabo lang. So this is 5. So the change in x from point 2 to point 1, that is 5. So since there's no change in y direction, we are going to enter this formula at 5, comma 0. So we can try it in CAD. Okay, so these are the drawings that we have made from our um, last lesson, the lesson 5. Since we are in the relative coordinate, I will just put my first point anywhere since we are using the last point as our reference point. So line enter. I'll just pick my point here, first point, and then um, according to our PowerPoint. So our coordinate will be at 5, 0. So that is at 5, 0. Okay, and that is your line. So make using our relative coordinate. So also one thing, the difference between the coordinate, relative coordinate and absolute coordinate. In absolute coordinate, we are putting hashtag before our coordinates. But this time, we are going to put at at every before the coordinates, before inputting our coordinates. So that is uh, the second difference of absolute and relative coordinates. Okay, so same goes for vertical direction. Let's see. So for example, we have here point 1 to point 2. There is a change vertically of 5, but there's no change in x coordinate. So using the format, the coordinate of P2 is now at 0, 5. Since there's no change in x, but the change in y is 5. So we can try it in CAD. No? Okay. So I will just pick my first point anywhere, and then at 0, since there's no change in x, comma, 5, change in y. So that is our line using the relative coordinate. Vertical lines. Vertical line kasi mag-isa lang pala siya. Okay, so if the point, okay, is in the top of your first point, so example, my first point is in the origin 0, 0, 0x and 0y. So if my second point lies on top of my first point, it has a positive y coordinate. But if that point lies below the first point, our y coordinate is negative. So same goes with horizontal direction. So if our point, so for example, we have here the origin 0, 0. So if our point lies in the right direction or right side of our first point, so our x coordinate will be positive. But if our point lies on the left side of the first point, our x coordinate will be negative. So we can try this example from lesson 5. But this time um we're going to use the relative coordinates. So let's try it in CAD. Okay. So I will just let me delete this now. So I will just pick anywhere to be my first point, since the reference point is the last point that we made. So our drawing will be the same. Okay. So let's try it. L enter. So I will just put my first point somewhere here. Okay, so from our figure, point 1. So point 1, we have change in x, so that is 3, but there's no change in y. So our coordinate will be at 3, 0. So that is at 3, 0. Okay, so we have here the second point, and we're going to the third point. So our third point, we have change in x going to the right and change in y going to up or upward direction. We have 1 unit to the right and 1 unit upward, so making our coordinate to be at 1, 1, since there's both of them has positive changes. So home enter. Okay, so at, so like I said earlier, 1, 1. Okay, so now we are going to point 4. So our point 4, there's no change in x, but there's a change in y. It's going upwards, so it is positive. So our coordinate will be at 0, 2. So at 0, 2. Okay, so we're going to the next point. So our next point is, okay, we move to the left by 4 units, 4 units, but there's no change in y direction, so we will just um, put at. So since we move to the left, this will be negative. So at negative 4, 0. Okay, so at negative 4, 0. Okay, so we have two options here to close the figure, or we're going to use our relative coordinates to close the figure. Okay, so we have here 3 units downward, so there's no change in x. So our coordinate will be at 0, negative 3. So let's input it. At, so 0, no change in x, and negative 3. Okay, so this is our drawing. Okay, so this is the first drawing that we have drawn using the relative coordinate, and this is the drawing that we have drawn using relative coordinate, or this one is the using absolute coordinate, and this one is using relative coordinates, so they look the same, right? Okay, so let's go back to, okay, we have our exercise number 1, figure 1 from our previous lesson. So the letter H, same letter. Okay, so I will assume that my first point, the point A, lies on 6 comma 1. So I will try. So line, I will just input the absolute coordinates. So 6 comma 1. Oh, but 6 comma 1 is somewhere here. So I will just assume again. I will assume. No. Okay, first point. I want it to be somewhere here. Hmm. Or maybe I can. Okay, let's try the line 6 comma. Hmm. So it is somewhere here. Okay, isip ko baka mag-alangan tayo. Okay, I will just point it. So this will be, okay, this is the final first location of my first point. Okay, so from our figure, going to the point B, so we move to the right, 1 point, so 1 point, and there's no change in x, so our coordinate is at 1 comma 0. So let's try it at 1 comma 0. Okay, we're going to C, so we moved upward, so that is the only movement that we have. So from B to C, so making our coordinates to be at 0 since there's no change in x, and comma 1 for change in y. So that is at 0 comma 1. So don't forget to put at before your coordinates. So next point. We have the point B. So we move to the right by 1 unit. 1 unit. So there's only a change in x. So our coordinate will be at 1 comma 0 since there's no change in y. Okay. Next point. So our next point is E. Point E, we go downward by 1 unit and there's no change in x. So our coordinate will be at 0 comma 1. So at 0 comma 1. Uy, because we move downward, it should be negative. No? So at 0 comma negative 1. Okay. Next point, we have point F. So we move to the right by 1 unit. So our coordinate will be at 1 comma 0 since there's no change in y coordinate. So at 1 comma 0. Okay. So we're down to the next point. So our next point is point G. So we move 3 units upward. So there's no change in x. Okay, our coordinate will be at 0 comma 3. And since we moved upward, so that is positive. So that is at 0 3. Okay, and then going to the next point. Our next point is H. So H, we move to the left. So that will be making our coordinate to be at negative 1 comma 0, since there's no change in y coordinate. So let's just input it. So at negative 1 comma 0, enter. Okay, so next point is point I. So point I, we move 1 unit downward. So that is at 0 comma negative 1, since there's no movement in x coordinate, and 1 unit downward. So at 0 negative 1. Okay, next point is J. So next point is J. We move to the left, 1 unit to the left. So making our coordinate to be at negative 1 comma 0, since there's no movement in or no change in y coordinate. So at negative 1 comma 0. Okay, we are now in our next point. So next point will be point K. So point K, we moved upward by 1 unit. So our coordinate will be at 0 comma 1. So at 0 comma 1. Okay, so we're getting there. Next is point L. So point L, we move to the left by 1 unit. So making our coordinate to be at negative 1 comma 0. At negative 1 comma 0. Okay, and now we have an option to close it, no? So type C, enter, or we're going to use the relative coordinate, which is, so let's see the figure, which is, so we move downward by 3 units. There's no change in x, so our coordinate will be at 0 comma negative 3. So let's try at 0 comma negative 3. Okay, and now our figure is closed. So we can see this is the figure from our lesson 5, drawing using the absolute coordinate, and this one using the relative coordinate. So they look the same. Yeah, they look the same. Okay, I will just move it here because we are going to our next figure. Okay, so these are the coordinates that we have entered earlier to make our letter H. So to make this figure, these are the coordinates that we have entered. Yeah? So for a summary. Okay, let's go to our figure number 2. Same figure from lesson 5. And we are now in, okay, so this is the point A. The last point is point M. We're going back to point A to close the figure. So let's try it using relative coordinate. But first, we need to assume our first point, the location of point A. So let's try. I will just try 6, 6. Okay, so using the absolute coordinate, I input 6, 6. So that is the location of our first point, the point A. Okay, so let's go back to our figure. point B. So point B, we move to the right. So our coordinate is at 1, comma 0, since there's no movement in y. At 1, comma 0. Okay. So next point is point C. So we moved upward. So our coordinate will be at 0, since there's no change in x, and our y is positive 1. So the coordinate will be at 0, comma 1. So this is your figure. Okay, so our next point is, okay, let's go back. Our next point is point D. So we move to the right, and then we move downward with both 1 units. Okay, so our x coordinate will be at 1, comma, negative 1. So at 1, comma, negative 1, since we move downward, making it negative. Okay, so next point is point E. So we're just going 1 unit downward. So our coordinate will be at 0, negative 1, since there's no movement or change in x direction. So that is at 0, 0, comma, negative 1. Okay, so we are now in point F. So point F, we move 2 units to the left, to the right. So our coordinate is positive 2. There's no change in y, so our y is 0. So let's try at 2, comma 0. Okay. So next figure, or next point, our figure, or our point moves 2 units to the left and 2 units upward. So our coordinates will be, the coordinate of our point G is at 2, comma 2. So let's try at 2, comma 2. So that is our point. Next is point H. So point H, we have 1.5 movement. 1.5. Okay. 1.5 upward. So making our coordinate to be at 0, comma 1.5. At 0, comma 1.5. Okay, next point. Next point we have I, HI. So we move 2 units to the left, so making it negative 2. The x is negative 2 and y is 0. So let's try at negative 2, comma 0. Okay, so our next point is point J. So we just move 1 unit upward. So our coordinate will be at 0, comma 1. So at 0, comma 1. Okay, next point. Next point is point K. So we move to the left by 1 unit. So our coordinate will be -1 at -1, comma 0. So at -1, comma 0. Okay, so we are going to point L. So point L, we move 2 units to the left and 1 unit downwards. So making the x and y both negative. So that is at -2, comma -1. So let's try at -2, comma -1. Okay. And now we're going to our next point. Next point is point M. So point M, we just move to the left by 1 unit. So that is -1 at -1, comma 0. So at -1, comma 0. Okay, so we have two options again. To close the figure, just type C, enter, or type the relative coordinates. So doon tayo sa mas mahaba. Mas pahirapan natin yung sarili natin. Okay, so from our figure, from M to A, going to A, we move 2.5 units. So 2.5 units, that will be at 0, comma -2.5. So let's try at 0, comma -2.5. And then our figure is now closed. So let's compare. So this is the figure we have drawn. This is the figure we have drawn from this, the highlighted ones. This is the figure that we have drawn using absolute coordinate. And this is the figure we have drawn using relative coordinates. So we have the same figures, but the coordinates are different. So from here, we can see from here that these are the coordinates that we have input from our last figure. So this figure, these are the coordinates that we have input. So going from point M going to A, we have input at 0, -2.5. Okay. So we are now going to our next figure, and this is the last figure for this exercise number 3. And this is the figure again from our last lesson, lesson 5. But this time we are going to use the relative coordinate. So using the relative coordinate, we will try to do it in CAD. Okay, so let's assume. Lagi lang tayong mag-assume. So our first point A to be in, let's assume 15, comma A, so that is absolute coordinate. So line, enter, 15, comma 10. So our first point, so this is the point A. So from point A, let's go to the figure. So it said that it moved to the right by 2 units. So our coordinate will be at 2, comma 0. So at 2, comma 0. Okay, so we have our point B, and now we're going to point C. So point C, we have 3 units upward. So our coordinate will be at 0, comma 3. So at 0, comma 3, enter. Okay, we have next point. So our next point is point B. So we move 1 unit to the right So our coordinate will be at 1 comma 0. So at 1, since there's change in x to the left, so that is positive 1 comma 0, since there's no change in y. Okay, so going to our next point is point E. So we can see from the figure that it moved to the left by 2 units, and uh, it moves upward by 2 units again. So making our coordinate to be x is negative 2 since we moved to the left, and our y coordinate is positive 2 since it moved upward. So let's try it. So at negative 2 comma positive 2 since we moved upward. Okay, so that is our point. Next point is point F. So we move to the left again by 2 units, and we move downward by 2 units. So this time we are going to use both negative in x and y since we move to the left and then we move downward. So by 2 units, both of them 2 units. Let's try it. At negative 2 because we move to the left, comma, and negative 2 because we move 2 units downward. Okay, so that is our point. And then the last point to be made before we close our figure is point G. So point G, we move to the right by 1 unit and there's no change in, or we move to the right by 1 unit and there's no change in y. So that is at 1 comma 0. So at 1, since we move to the right, comma 0, since there's no change in y, so our point will be like that. Okay, so to close the figure, pahirapan natin sarili natin. Let's make it in relative coordinate. Okay, so from our figure, from G to A, we move 3 units downwards. So our coordinate will be at 0 comma negative 3. At 0 comma negative 3. 0 since there's no movement in x, and negative 3 since there is a change in y direction and it is downward. So now this is our figure using relative. So this is the figure that we have drawn using relative, and this is the figure that we have drawn using absolute coordinate. Okay, so these are the coordinates that we have input to make this figure using the relative coordinates. So as you can see, we have always at in every beginning before we type our coordinate if we are using the relative. So don't forget to put at before our coordinates. Okay, so that's the end of our lesson 6. See you on lesson 7. Goodbye.